Kingdom Hearts 3 is a weird game. If you've seen some of my videos, you probably already know my general thoughts on this game. If you haven't, here it is in a nutshell. The base game is mediocre at best, but the DLC released 1 year later includes some of the best Kingdom Hearts content we've had in over a decade. But why is this? Why are the two parts of the game so polarizing, to the point where I had to question if the same team that made the game also developed the DLC? And how exactly does one even rate this game, given how drastically different in quality the two parts are? I want to explore this, and also provide a bit of an update on how I feel about certain aspects of the game, because while my general opinion hasn't changed, if I could redo my previous two videos, I would. So let's just let this be that. Before we move on, I should mention that I'll be primarily addressing gameplay in this video. I should also say that I'm going to be critiquing aspects of Cage 3, but that doesn't mean I'm putting down anyone who enjoys that aspect of the game. I'll speak from the perspective of someone who's playing Kingdom Hearts 3 on the harder difficulty modes, notably Critical Mode and Level 1. And look, if that's not your type of thing, that's fine. But chances are a lot of the things I say won't be very relevant to your preferred playstyle. With that being said, I'm going to break this up into two big sections, where I talk about the base game without the DLC or updates, and then the DLC itself. Let's start off with base Cage 3. It's often difficult to pinpoint a central cause of the issues in Cage 3. There's a lot of minor details that I can critique. Ultimately though, the main problem boils down to two major points. Battles and mobs are far too big in size, and Sora's moveset is too focused on large area of effect attacks without any meaningful interactions or any semblance of combat flow. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. Patching out either of these issues without any other changes would be a terrible idea, because almost everything in Kingdom Hearts 3 builds upon this base that they've set, and ruining that infrastructure collapses the entire game. In fact, even these two ideas feed into each other, like the chicken and the egg. The mob sizes are huge, so Sora needs tools to deal with them. Sora gets giant AoE attacks, so they make the mob sizes big to accommodate that. It's an infinite feedback loop that unfortunately bleeds into every other aspect of the game. There is no central issue, it's a core philosophy that's inherently broken. Let's talk about the first one. The mob fights in Kingdom Hearts 3 are huge, in terms of both enemy count and the types of enemies thrown at you. This is obvious to anyone who's played the game. We all remember facing off against 10 flame cores within the first 30 minutes of the game, or the never-ending waves and waves of Unversed in Monstropolis with those damn turtles. Even many boss battles feed into this idea of having multiple targets to deal with simultaneously. Skull summons little wolves, Davy Jones summons tentacles, Lump of Horror summons hands that shoot fire, Grim Guardian summons flowers that can eat you. The Keyblade Graveyard battles pit you against multiple organization members at once. The interesting thing is, if you've never played the game on critical mode, it may never have registered with you how unfair some of these fights can be. So imagine this situation. You die in 2 hits from any of these enemies on screen. What do you do? With such a huge amount of enemies, it's far too easy to get cheap-shotted by some random one you couldn't see off screen, and as such, the game was designed with this in mind. How do you deal with such large, disjointed forces against you? You fight fire with fire, quite literally. Sora's move kit in Kingdom Hearts 3 is comprised of huge area of effect nukes. Team attacks, attraction flows, many form changes with their wide arcing swings and attacks, links, shot locks, the list goes on. This type of gameplay isn't inherently bad, but it does show that Kingdom Hearts 3 at many times resembles the likes of a Dynasty Warrior-esque game. I believe they're referred to as crowd combat fighting games. Many times the enemies are fodder. Their moves, how they can attack you, how you're positioned, how you can exploit openings and counterattack. Common features in action games are irrelevant, and it comes down to who can use the biggest, flashiest AoE bomb to nuke every opponent in the room. So what's the issue? Why am I making such a big deal out of this? So what if Cage 3's style of gameplay differs from the previous games, as long as it remains fun? Well, here's the punchline. Cage 3 only really resembles these crowd combat fighting games on the very surface level. The moment we delve deeper, it's immediately obvious that it fails at replicating the fun these types of games have, especially on the higher difficulties. And the reason for that has in part to do with this idea of balance, but not in the way that you might think. Balance is a word thrown around pretty carelessly by many people in the community, so I'll say it straight up right now. Kingdom Hearts 3 is not bad purely because it is unbalanced. There's a plethora of other issues, and the whole subject of balance in games can actually be quite nuanced, so reducing it down to unbalanced is bad is a very naive way to look at it. With that being said, how does balance play a role in this whole ordeal? To put it simply, it's a risk-reward trade-off that isn't worth it. The amount you get for using the worst options in the game isn't any more rewarding than the better options. Links are broken, you've heard this a million times before, but the implications of this is huge because it turns out that links are also your saving grace for many battles on level 1 crit. Team attacks and attraction flows appearing are RNG, and therefore aren't reliable. Using shot locks is often risky as charging them forces you to stand still, and similarly, while many form changes have huge AoE attacks, they also have uncancelable finishers, huge amounts of beginning or end lag between moves, and most importantly, are locked behind attacking the enemies up front, creating a huge risk to get hit randomly and die. Rather than use measly magic or risky physical attacks to build up to a form that may not even help, it is almost better in every situation to use a link, which prevents you from dying during the entire duration, deals massive AoE damage, and even heals half your health. The most important takeaway here is not that links are unbalanced, but that almost everything else in the game is balanced around links. This means that other options are straight up not viable for use and will actively get you killed. And this is where the central discussion of balance should lie. Not just that Kingdom Hearts 3 is an unbalanced mess, but how nothing else but links is a feasible option in the face of the grand design philosophy of the game. Take away links and you're left in a situation where it is nigh impossible to deal with enemy waves on level 1 crit without camping it out, slowly and painfully. The game pushes itself into a corner with a combination of action-based difficulty and crowd fighting-esque gameplay. It's a fusion that just doesn't work. And perhaps most ironically, I wouldn't have such a huge problem with this if links were just more interesting to use. As it stands, Ralph is the most interactive Link in the game. Every other one amounts down to nothing more than cutscenes that you can press buttons in. And even the novelty of Ralph placing blocks methodically gets old after a while. It's just not something you'd expect out of the moment-to-moment action style of gameplay the rest of KH3 is known for. It might seem like I'm being unfair to KH3 at this point. What can I possibly expect out of the game? Am I being too critical, perhaps even biased in my judgment? Haven't I seen those combo videos where people perform devastating attacks on enemies and form changes? Surely that counts as meaningful gameplay, and at the very least makes form changes a worthwhile option to explore. Regarding the bias point, I genuinely don't know. This is where you might have to come in and tell me. Am I expecting too much out of Kingdom Hearts 3's gameplay? Is it too much to ask for a game with synergy behind its elements beyond such a surface level? Combo videos are amazing, and I've seen and enjoyed my fair share of them, but so many of these feature very surface level gameplay that the moment you try to dissect what's going on, it is nothing more beyond a basic combo of attack a few times, switch keyblades, attack a few more times, switch keyblades, use a finisher. And this isn't me saying that the person who made the combo video isn't skilled or anything like that, it's just that KH3's level of depth doesn't go anywhere beyond the surface level of just flashiness. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being able to appreciate and have fun with this style of flashy gameplay, but perhaps it also exposes the side of KH3 where many are clawing for just the tiniest drop of meaning out of a system with little potential in the first place. To fully drive this point home, I want to talk specifically about form changes, which are by far the most interesting mechanic and also perhaps the biggest missed potential. There are 22 form changes in KH3 without including second form repeats, and only a handful of those 22 even provide a shred of utility beyond giant AoE damage. I'm going to go through every single form change in the game for the sake of clarity, and mind you, I will be as generous as possible when talking about each one, to the point where you might be wondering if what I'm saying can even be considered actual utility. I want to give KH3 its fair chance, and perhaps this will illustrate my main issue with form changes, that most, if not all of them, are ultimately the same thing. Skip to this timestamp of the video at any point if you stop caring, because this might get a little tedious and repetitive, as you'll quickly see. The most notable thing of second form is Magna Spiral, which can bring enemies in as a form of crowd control, but a move like this gets quickly outclassed by most other forms in the game, or even once you obtain Arrow. There are a few utilities to it in beginning game, so I'll give credit where credit's due. Counter Shield is perhaps the best and only form in the game aside from its copy Grand Chef that is worth using over Link's, as its 360 guard allows you to store attacks and unleash powerful AoE reprisals against enemies, which works surprisingly well with overwhelmingly large mobs. Shooting Star and Magic Launcher imitates Cage 2's Wisdom form long-ranged attacks, but their lack of damage output in AoE means they get quickly outclassed. It should be noted that Magic Launcher's R2 is a huge AoE bomb, but getting to Magic Launcher in the first place requires filling up the situation gauge twice, which is often difficult and risky to accomplish. You can argue that Shooting Star's R2 fills up the situation gauge quickly, but the trade-off is that you must be standing still, giving it little utility in mob fights with multiple targets. Magic Launcher also has access to Magic Galvanizer, an ability that increases the damage output of your magic spells the longer your combo lasts. This would be a cool ability if it weren't for the reliance on Grand Magic, an RNG situation command to extend your combos, but as a result it requires too much setup to use consistently and on the fly, and other options usually outclass it. Mirage Staff has a cool after image technique that occurs every time you dash, allowing you to deal lots of damage from far away and quickly fill up your situation gauge. It also has Magic Galvanizer, but suffers from the same issues as Magic Launcher. At this point you're probably thinking, well, this isn't terrible, I've talked about each of these forms for a decent while and they seem to have some form of utility at the very least. Well, buckle in, because that's about as good as the forms get. Hyper Hammer and Drill Punch have big, arcing AoE attacks. Hyper Hammer can instantly perform a finisher, which is a big AoE attack. It also has a downwards closing strike, which has limited uses occasionally, and Drill Punch's finisher has a few iframes as you go underground, but as you can imagine, such a small window is difficult to find an actual use for. Agile Claws and Twin Yo-Yos have big, arcing AoE attacks. Blizzard Claws is a copy of Agile Claws. Blizzard Blades has big arcing AoE attacks and a downwards closing strike. High Wind and Wheel of Fate have big arcing AoE attacks. High Wind has a downward strike similar to Hyper Hammer, and its finisher has a few iframes similar to Drill Punch. Both uses are very limited. Nano Gear has big arcing AoE attacks and a 360 guard. Grand Chef is a copy of Counter Shield. Honey Spout and Honey Launcher is a Shooting Star and Magic Launcher copy with a 360 guard. Boom Hammer and Clock Drill is a copy of Hyper Hammer and Drill Punch with a 360 guard. Ultimate Form has big arcing AoE attacks and a 360 guard. Its teleport closing has iframes, but like High Wind and Drill Punch, it's such a tiny amount that it's almost completely useless. Dark, Light, and Double Form have big arcing AoE attacks, which are comparatively a lot more snappy and cancelable compared to the other forms. They also have a 360 guard. That was probably pretty tedious to go through, but I hope at least that drives my point home. Most of these forms are identical in utility. Hyper Hammer boasts of slow attacks with huge AoE and stun, but when Twin Yo-Yos and Blizzard Claws and High Wind accomplishes the exact same thing, is there any advantage that Hyper Hammer has over the others? The few moves that have any potential for utility is me scrounging for an ounce of something interesting to talk about, and even then I wouldn't consider using most of them just because of how rare and situational they are. Whether it's iframes not lasting long enough, or a way to get to the ground that can be accomplished just as easily with air step with no cost, the most shallow levels of utility can't be found anywhere in the majority of these forms. As for the few with interesting mechanics, notably the forms near the beginning of the game, only Counter Shield and maybe Mirage Staff doesn't get outclassed completely by everything else. Even in terms of magic, all the forms either retain the same magic spells or changes every spell to have the exact same utility, such as all AoE or all projectile. I'm gonna be a shill here for a second and compare these form changes with a dry form in Cage 2. Not to illustrate that I'm some sort of elitist that wants Cage 3 to be exactly like 2FM, but perhaps a good example of something that I'd consider to have depth and utility, something Cage 3 should be striving for. Let's take Master Form for example. Master Form's combos are all aerial combos, so it works well against many opponents that stay primarily in the air. It changes every single magic spell completely. Fire now has the property to quickly close in on enemies, Blizzard includes a backflip during its cast, and while you can argue that this is a stretch, there are genuine uses for this to dodge an attack and quickly punish enemies. Thunder does great AoE damage as well as a circular movement to dodge attacks. Magnet lasts twice as long, which allows for devastating combos by combining it with fast consecutive hits, a property that Master Form's base combo satisfies really well as its thunder magic. Master Form has aerial dodge, which gives you mid-air parry frames. It also has an ability called Endless Magic, which allows Sora to perform magic infinitely without ever being forced to use a finisher. This allows for cool interactions where you can force a physical finisher from Master Form by spamming magic, because the magic still counts towards your combo counter. A common use for this is comboing with Reflect, because Reflect has Keyblade hits that stagger your enemies without adding any revenge value, allowing you to quickly reach your finisher and deal massive amounts of damage, and the opponent won't retaliate in the middle of your combo. I could probably go on, but I think you get the idea, and I want to make it clear that with this example, I don't want KH3 to create a carbon copy of Master Form. What I wish the game had was more of a reason to use form changes. I wish that the form changes had more unique properties to them that change up the way you play the game and allows for cool interactions by combining with other abilities you have. I wish you could learn unique properties of each form change, apply those properties in your moment-to-moment gameplay, and have moments of, aha, I could do this to avoid this attack, and punish accordingly. And you can argue that there's no way that 22 form changes could all have the amount of depth as the 5 forms in 2FM, and you would be right, but perhaps that's also part of the problem. Maybe the focus should have been more on quality of the forms rather than quantity. If KH3 had only offered 2 or 3 forms with each having a well thought out moveset that synergizes with the rest of the game's mechanics, I think I would have preferred that much more than to the 22 mediocre transformations that we received. Fundamentally speaking, trying to build upon the system that KH3 has established is a lost cause for almost anything that the game does well or has potential to do well with. It's almost always dragged down by another issue lurking in the background, all perpetuated by this insistent focus on scale over substance, the very same 2 issues I talked about at the beginning. Take this combo for example. Arrow brings the enemies together, and then following up with a buzzsaw flow motion is a cool use of the technique, and one I would consider to have smart utility because it fills up your situation gauge almost instantly. However, what does this ultimately accomplish? You get a form change which, other than counter shield, is going to have an AoE style of attacking, and now we return back to the root problem where you may as well have just used a link. Perhaps you can argue I'm being a bit too nitpicky. It is a cool use of an ability with a functionality to it, but when you factor in the final result of using said combo, can it even be considered a move with utility? Or is it a crutch to work around the questionable game mechanic that involves unlocking your forms by doing what you're supposed to be doing through attacking enemies? You may also have seen a recently discovered tech in KH3 known as item cancelling. Normally when Sora switches Keyblades, there's a huge lag between the switch. By throwing an item and switching, you can immediately switch Keyblades and reset your combo while continuing to attack enemies. This is an incredibly cool exploit, but its potential is once again brought down by the lack of any actual substance. Is there any reason to reset your combo, or is it just another avenue for flashy, cool-looking attacks? This whole exploit, which by all means should have amazing potential, is brought down by the fact that barely any forms have any utility beyond big AoE damage. Furthermore, forms being locked behind situation commands means that much of the potential for combos is locked until you unlock these forms, and thus much of the battle will be spent setting up for said combo rather than executing it. Let's play a bit of devil's advocate here. Let's say you argue that item cancelling helps you maintain stagger endurance, a mechanic that large enemies have in KH3 where after enough hits they begin to stagger for a period of time. And while you can argue that has utility to it, the ability to item cancel still doesn't change the fact that you're dealing with tens of enemies at once, so your chances of getting hit behind your back is still extremely high. And once again we come back to square one where we ask ourselves, why would we even risk trying to get a form to item cancel and maintain a stagger on a large enemy when we can just nuke them with Simba? Even the bosses fall prey to this grand design philosophy that they have, which they just can't seem to ignore. Skull by himself is not a terrible fight. He has too much HP for when you fight him, but his moves aren't unreasonable, and he staggers properly when you hit him. However, ask anyone who has tried to survive his DM on level 1 without any links and you'd get a similar response, ranging from "it's nearly impossible" to "just hope you get lucky and don't get hit." Davy Jones has a similar experience with his Tentacles DM, and so does Grim Guardianess when she summons flowers. For almost everything Cage 3 does, the same issues come back like an infestation, ravaging all corners of the game and destroying all potential it has. And the reason why Cage 3 was made this way is more than likely that the game's goal was to appeal to a mass casual audience who didn't care for intricate game mechanics, and instead chose to focus on the hack and slash mash buttons to win style that the previous numbered titles were stereotyped to be. Unfortunately, it seems that most of the hidden depth in Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 went over their heads, and as a result, Cage 3 turned out to be an empty shell of what made the previous titles so good, with little substance and lots of flash. If you recall at the beginning of this video, I claimed that what came afterwards in the DLC was some of the best Kingdom Hearts content we've had in over a decade. But how did they address all of these issues that I brought up? And the quick answer to that is, they did, and they also didn't. At this point, what Kingdom Hearts 3 was missing were simply good, fun, and fair fights. The main game consisted of giant clusters of mob fights and rather mediocre bosses, both accentuated by the issues that I've addressed in the previous section. All that the game needed were fights that aren't designed around a combat system, but focuses more on fair, interactable gameplay. But that's a lot easier said than done. The game had shown a few pitiful attempts at this in the story, with the most prominent example being Anti-Aqua, a fight that most would agree with being pathetically easy due to how simple it was to cheese her with Sora's overpowered moveset, designed for giant mobs and multi-targeted bosses. And yet, with that challenge in mind, the team behind the DLC super bosses managed to create genuinely great bosses that were balanced for the game's system despite everything else. How did they pull it off? The only way they could, by dismantling the combat system entirely. Let's look back at the two major issues I listed previously. Mob battle sizes are now completely irrelevant regarding the limit cut data boss fights. They are single target bosses that don't actually summon other targets to attack you, or if they do, these targets aren't disjointed separate entities and actually fight you with some semblance of patterns. For the most part though, it's straight up 1v1, no items, Fox only, final destination. Secondly, most of Sora's large AoE nukes were quite literally cut from existence. Team attacks and attraction flows don't exist in these battles. Even Link's, the most broken abilities in the base game, were nerfed to hell because these bosses operated on finding and punishing small windows for openings, and attacking them otherwise will cause you to deal chip damage, as all of them have a defensive armor when not staggered. This means that using Links without any thought or consideration as to how to force an opening will almost be completely useless in many situations, and you'll end up hardly dealing any damage to them. Even if you could cheese a fight with a Link, which I won't deny that you can with a few if you're decently leveled, I can make the same argument that I would for many battles in Cage 2, that despite there being many ways to cheese fights in the game, it's actually more fun to fight the battle out by dodging attacks and punishing openings and exploring your other options, because it's not the balancing of the options that matter, it's whether an option dominates the entire game and leaves little room for something else. This goes back to our whole discussion of balance we had. In the base game of Cage 3, not using Links would often mean a slow, frustrating slog through a battle with little interaction. Therefore, Links dominated the majority of the game. In Limit Cut, not cheesing the fight with a Link may put you at a disadvantage technically speaking, but the battles remain fair and fun regardless of which option you use. And that's really as simple as this supposedly complex discussion can get. The game remains fun. To further help these super bosses work, base Sora got a huge ability upgrade in a patch release before the DLC, and his combos were dramatically sped up with instantaneous cancel windows everywhere. The game continues building on the unblockable attacks used on Dark Inferno, which means there's actual thought being put into how to avoid certain moves. For example, you can choose a dodge roll, or you can time a reprisal to iframe your way through an unblockable slice from Marluxia. Perhaps what's even more interesting is that now that most of Sora's overpowered tools are useless, form changes and item cancelling can actually have bits of utility to shine through. As far as item cancelling goes, it's possible to create long combos by cancelling your attacks and resetting your combo, allowing for some pretty neat interactions. Take this clip for example. I'm able to repeatedly cancel my combo to hit the boss into the air, allowing me to land an air dive which deals really good damage. As for form changes, many of them are still pretty terrible, because their moves are far too laggy and slow to create reasonable follow-ups. It's why most people end up using Oathkeeper and Oblivion against these fights, because those happen to be the only forms that don't severely limit your abilities, and provide fast, snappy, and responsive attacks that has follow-up potential. At the same time, I won't deny that it's fun to mess around with these fights, even with other form changes, and build potential flashy combos. Like I said previously, a lot of this is flashiness over any actual substance, and that hasn't really changed. There's little advantage to using Hyper Hammer over double form in these fights. It won't deal any extra damage, it'll be significantly more laggy and difficult to chain together, and the risk of dying will be a lot higher as a result. However, this time the trade-off for this risk is that I die and I retry the fight, which doesn't change the fact that the fights are still good, regardless of what happens. It's not frustrating or a slog to go through, it's not inconsistent and random, and the deaths are more often than not the fault of the player rather than the game's RNG. And as a result, these fights are still fun to play, regardless of how you choose to play them. So hey, to all those out there saying that we just want KH3 to be a clone of 2FM, maybe you're right this time. KH3's DLC, like 2FM, can be broken, unbalanced, and completely cheesed through. But at the same time, they remain fun to play regardless of how you approach them. And if you ask me what's the most important aspect for a game to have, that would be all I ask for. So, Kingdom Hearts 3 is a weird game. It has a side filled with issues stemming from a flawed design philosophy, but it also has a side that really manages to capture the essence of what made the previous numbered titles so consistently fun. And because of this, it's difficult for me to say how good the game truly is, and quite frankly, I think boiling down the game to a single score would be unfair to both sides of this coin. Does the excellence of Limit Cut fix the issues with KH3? Not by a landslide. The base game hasn't changed much even with the added abilities, and why would it? All of the issues still persist from a very fundamental design standpoint. Experiencing the releases of Kingdom Hearts 3 was a roller coaster of emotions, from excitement to disappointment to a small spark of hope and genuine shock that we finally received content on par with the best of Kingdom Hearts again. Pessimistically, maybe this entire DLC was a fluke. The developers got lucky, or they just happened to accidentally tweak the game in such a way that made it fun. I like to think otherwise though, and while optimism can lead to disappointment, I'm still looking forward to what Kingdom Hearts has in store in the future.